In the newsletter commentary that all of you read every word of, like you do every week on Fridays, I brought up this old-fashioned word, the word steward. Now, in the newsletter, I used The Lord of the Rings to talk about steward. I'm going to put that away. We'll talk about a different movie here in a minute. But steward is that it's an old-fashioned word, and in some ways, unfortunately, it's kind of an old-fashioned concept, but it's something we need to pay attention to. Because a steward is a person who does not try to control, who doesn't try to take charge of a thing, and yet chooses to take responsibility for it, to be held accountable for it. Doesn't try to gain wealth or to gain authority or power, but rather holds themselves responsible for the well-being of that thing and for the running of that thing. And in a healthy group, a healthy family system, a healthy church, there's no limit to the number of stewards you can have. You can only have one king or one queen or one emperor or potentate or whatever for a group. But you can have an unlimited number of stewards. And really, if we are to be healthy as a church, we would all be stewards. We would not just consider ourselves members, although there's an important homiletic to that too. But in addition to being members of a body, we are all stewards. And that's why we talk about church giving as stewardship. And I talked about that more last week. I'm not going to go on and on this week. But it's worth remembering that church giving, it's not just, well, okay, here's a donation, here's a little bit of something to keep you going, to keep the lights on, whatever. It is a matter of stewardship because we are all being called to take responsibility for this. Unless we all think that way, then a church really can't thrive. And you see some churches that appear to be thriving and don't necessarily have stewardship. Some of those are a top-down model of church authority, and those are really unsustainable. They might thrive for a little bit, but in the end, they grind to a halt under the weight of all that authority. Because one person or one group of leaders cannot make the whole thing run. Everyone has to be a steward. And there's cult of personality churches that are toxic. Again, focused on one person or focused on a small group of people, and that's not stewardship. So church giving as stewardship is so much more than what we might see for other organizations that just require your donations, require givers. You have to pour your heart into it. That's why we talk about time and talent and treasure as stewardship. It's holistic. We offer ourselves. So that's one old-fashioned word. Another old-fashioned word that confronts us in our readings this morning, and more than one reading, is that word abide. And in all of history that I'm aware of, which that's a big qualifier, that I'm aware of, there's only two characters that really like to use that word abide. And one of them is real and the other one is fictional. The real one is Jesus, or in the case of our readings, John talking about Jesus, both in his letter and in his gospel. And the other one is the dude from The Big Lebowski. And maybe some of us have seen this movie and some haven't, but there is that famous line, maybe the most famous line from the movie that comes at the very, very end of the movie. And that line is, the dude abides. The dude abides. And now after he says that, there's sort of a narrator character who's called the stranger, played by Sam Elliott with the deep voice and the handlebar mustache. And so he comments on this utterance, the dude abides. And he says, I take comfort in that. Let's have it here. It's good knowing he's out there, the dude, taking her easy for all us sinners. If I had a handheld mic, I'd try to do the words. Taking her easy for all us sinners. But why does a stranger call himself and all of us in the process sinners? What's the reason for that? The dude is righteous and we're not, or what is it? And I thought about it a lot, and I came to the conclusion that what he's saying is the dude knows how to abide, and we don't. Especially because this comes at the end of the movie where he's been through a lot. And despite the fact that this is a very kind of a slacker movie where you think it's just going to be three guys bowling, the whole movie. But it turns out a lot happens, and it's sort of an overly convoluted plot. And all of this that they go through of mistaken identity and violence and on and on and on, to where in the end, and I don't want to spoil it. How old is this movie? Am I allowed to spoil it? Spoil it, okay. In the end, one of the dude's two best friends dies. And he has to deal with that, right? So that's a lot to handle, it's a lot to process. But then it comes to that final moment where he's talking to the stranger at the bowling alley, ball in hand, and that's when he says, the dude abides. There's this sense that whatever happens in life, he's going to get through it. And that's good, and that's positive, except there's a sense in my mind of detachment in that. That he has some kind of ability to ignore the events of his own life, and he can abide no matter what. That's detachment. And I'm not sure if that's the same sense in which Jesus uses the word abide. When he abides, it's a little different because he doesn't just say, the Lord abides, and then that's it, right? He says, I abide in you. Abide in me as I abide in you. And I think we forget that first part sometimes. We remember that Jesus calls us, invites us to abide in him, but we forget the premise. And John in his letter, 1 John, he hammers that down. He really emphasizes that and says, we love God because God first loved us. We abide in Jesus because he first chose to abide in us. And when he abides in us, what does that mean? Is that same kind of detached sense that the dude abides in? I don't think it is at all, because that is removed from relationship. It's removed from humanity, and Jesus is going the opposite direction. He's going inward, abiding with us. But if we're trying to sometimes life can get very painful and it can get very difficult, and we do take comfort in that, like the stranger says. We take comfort in those who seem to be able to detach themselves from it, because it's the opposite of what we so often do, isn't it? I mean, maybe I'll just speak for myself. In my anxiety, I tend to attach. I tend to try to take control of my situation. I try to take the bull by the horns and say, well, if it is to be, it's up to me. Or if it's going to be done right, you got to do it yourself. All of that. That's all attachment. And we're faced with this duality of saying, well, are we going to detach and just let it all like water off a duck's back? I've got more cliches if you want them. We can just keep it coming. Or are we gonna have a stranglehold on life and try to wrestle it to the ground? There's another cliche there of the egg, and they talk about this with parenting quite a bit. Parenting is like holding an egg. Hold it too tightly and you crush it. Hold it too loosely and you drop it. And that's what attachment and detachment feel like to me. But I think, like is so often the case, Jesus presents us with a third way, a middle way between those. And some people would call that unattachment or non-attachment. And Heather and I were chatting about this a few days ago. So thanks, Heather, for this little spark. And so what does that involve? And being unattached. And Jesus uses that, I think, to help us understand that concept. Jesus uses that metaphor. He uses the word picture of the vine. And it's hard to think, well, why would Jesus be using a vine and branches to talk about unattachment? Because the vine is obviously attached to the branch, so where does this go? And I think it's that if the vine were a person and woke up every morning saying, oh no, where am I going to get my nutrients from? I need soil, I need, photosynthesis and all this, and I need to produce fruit, and I can't do it. with the resources I have, or I can't count on these resources that I have. So I, as the branch, am going to reach down to the ground and try to grab up some soil so I can feed myself. That's a branch that doesn't trust the vine. The branch is not abiding in the vine. It's simply, it's connected, but there's nothing there. And all of the anxiety is, and I have to get it myself. I have to do it for myself. And I got to produce this fruit, and I have a quota, gosh darn it, that I have to fill, or I'm going to get chopped off and thrown away. And let me just take a quick aside one moment, because I'm talking mostly about the positive aspects of this verse, but there's some really troubling sounding stuff in there too, where we might read that and think, I have a quota. I have to produce fruit, or Jesus is going to show up with his machete or whatever and chop me off and throw me into the fire, which we sometimes read as hell, right? It's easy to read it that way, especially the way we've been conditioned culturally. And that's probably a topic more so for another sermon, but just suffice it to say, I really believe that Jesus is talking about that we are not each just one branch, that there are multiple branches in each of us, and that sometimes a part of us does need to get separated. It does need to get burned. It does need to get pruned so that God can encourage the trust and the faith and the love that's in us and let the rest of it fall away. So there's that little aside for that. But if we're talking about the vine and we're talking about abiding, what it means for that branch to abide in the vine, I see a blend of trust and agency. Yes, for the vine to say, I don't care about nutrients, I don't care about fruit, I'm just going to chill, I'm just going to abide, in that sense that the dude does, that detached sense, well, that's just apathy. Jesus isn't showing us apathy. Jesus wants to understand what that intersection is. To trust that we are receiving what we need from the vine, and that we are obliged to use it, to produce the fruit. And so when I think the stranger is being a little hard on himself when he calls himself a sinner, when he calls us sinners. All of us are just, well, he gets it and we don't. There's a little bit of guilt there that I think we do tend to deal with sometimes. And the problem is if we start to feel guilty about our failures to abide in the way Jesus abides in us, and our failures to trust in the vine or our failures to produce the fruit, if we feel guilty for those failures, we're never going to learn it. And I think that's mostly what we see in ourselves. And when we look around, we see that spiral of failure that comes from guilt and shame, and then that leads to more failure, which leads to more guilt and shame. But if instead we trust that this is a process, parts of us will get pruned away, and then we'll grow again, and we'll try again. And that is what Jesus is shepherding us through, is that inhale, exhale. Fail, succeed, fail, succeed. And then we come back to that word stewardship. I think once we've seen the word abide, we've seen that concept of abide the way Jesus is showing us, then we know what it means to be a steward. And if any of us is running around here saying, problems, 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 Chicken Little, the sky is falling, and if there's things wrong with this church or with this congregation, and if I want it done right, I got to do it myself. It's up to me to fix. Then we're not abiding. We're not stewards. We're trying to make ourselves kings who are there to produce the resources and not simply to receive them and use them. But on the other hand, if we just sit back and be like, whatever, man, it is what it is, we're not stewards then either. So I think in this little mini season of stewardship that we've concocted here, I would love for us to look at that intersection of trust and agency. To remember that God chose to love us first, Jesus chose to abide in us first, so that we would have everything that we need. And that once we have taken stock of that, to produce that fruit. And when we succeed, awesome. When we fail, that's okay. Let's come back and do it again. And we'll get them next time. And as stewards, again, we are all on that same page. We all have different roles. We all have different strengths, different talents, but we are all stewards, and we are all called to abide together and in Jesus. And toward that end, I really want us, like when I say agency, I really mean it. I want all of us to take responsibility for that, to see ourselves as abiding in stewardship. So I'm going to ask you to declare it, right? The dude says, he calls himself third person, and he's the one who says the dude abides. Let's do that, but with your name, and we're going to do it together, okay? So, the count of 3, just say your first name and abides. You ready? 1, 2, 3. Ryan abides. Aaron abides. Mindy abides. Christina abides. Charlotte abides. I take comfort in that. Amen.